We are joined for the final session of the Virtual Study Day this afternoon by Linda Jones, and the beady-eyed amongst you will have noticed there's also another guest. But first of all, I will introduce Linda Jones, who is a university librarian. She's the librarian for the law and criminology degrees, and is an absolute asset to all of our students. Welcome, Linda. Thank you for joining us. Would you like to introduce your other guest?
Right, I brought my comfort blanket with me. This is Pablo, the University of Portsmouth penguin, who lives in the library and spends quite a bit of the year appearing in photos on our Twitter stream or in cartoons on our blog, explaining the vagaries of the library to students. He's warm and cuddly and probably hasn't got the sort of image problems that the word librarian is attached to. So I thought he would make a friendly face for anyone watching.
Excellent. Will he be answering any questions today?
I think not.
Shy on camera?
Yes.
Excellent. Thank you, Linda. Now, we have some games to play, Linda, this afternoon with our props. Now, we're going to start off by talking about information searching because as far as academic writing is concerned, it's absolutely vital to be writing using the correct sources and the quantity and quality of sources that we want to see in essays. So, Linda, you have given us here the top 4 errors that students come across when they are information searching. So if I reveal, Linda has seen these before, if I reveal, Linda will be able to explain a little bit more about some of the problems that students encounter. So the first one there, not understanding access to electronic resources.
I think this is something that hits students like a brick wall when they first start a course here with us. Quite a lot of people are not coming direct from school or college, have not used an academic library before, or may be working quite remotely from any library. And unfortunately that used to be people being at a distance, but it can also mean people living in the UK where their local public libraries closed down and there is nowhere for them to go for information. So because we do distance learning here, we do actually concentrate a lot on electronic resources. These may be entirely new to some people. So actually understanding what we're doing can be a little difficult. And again, Pablo's here as a comfort blanket for me because normally I have a nice big screen where I can explain, you press here and you click that and then the magic happens. But it's not really about that. It's about actually understanding that most information is not freely available. We actually have to buy it. And we can buy electronic resources in a number of formats. Quite often the question that I'm asked is, I could buy this as a Kindle book, why haven't you got it? Well, the problem is that if publishers are selling it as a Kindle book, they're unlikely to sell it at a reasonable price for us when we have potentially thousands of users at any one time. So we buy electronic access to books and to journals on the basis of either multi-user access for anybody registered with the University of Portsmouth, or 3-user limited access to specific items for the length of period for which we're subscribing to them. So with books, we may say we have an electronic book, and when you go into it, you can't get past the front page because 3 other people are already using it. It is really important that students understand that quite often people go into an e-book simply to download one chapter, and having done that they'll be out in 5 minutes. So it's not like when you borrow a book, a physical book from the library, and it's not available for 4 weeks. It may just be go and take a tea break, and when you come back the book's available. If you're having real difficulties with electronic access, the thing to do is actually to talk to those warm, friendly people at the library that Pablo supports on the online chat. And they can actually, online during the week, guide you through getting into things. There's a whole new language about accessing. My pet hate is the fact that the system that we use in general to access e-resources has the incomprehensible name of Shibboleth.
I've often wondered why that is.
It's a biblical word, a particularly unhelpful biblical word, in that it relates to an Old Testament story where if you couldn't say the word properly, you were killed.
Ah.
It's not the way that the library really wants to be presenting itself to its users, and I certainly would never have endorsed it. However, somebody somewhere thought it was a brilliant idea, so we're lumbered with it. But Shibboleth basically is a national system for HE in this country, whereby having the right username and password, you are given the appropriate level of access. And really and truly, the key thing to understand when you're accessing electronic resources is never to click on the simple sign-in button, because that nearly always leads you straight to an invoice. And if you want to see the problem that surrounds me for most of the year about how on earth do I afford these things, you will see the prices charged per article or per chapter for the books. You don't really want to know anything about that. The thing to do is to remember that no matter where you are studying, you are actually part of the UK Higher Education Federation, and that you are based at the University of Portsmouth, even if you've never visited.
Yes, and that does begin with a U.
Yes.
As well as a P sometimes, depending on which...
Yes, it depends. I really would like to rechristen the university when it's rebranded as ABC University.
Yes.
It would save hours of time.
So there are very good and clear guides that the library have written that explain step by step how to get into these systems, aren't they?
Yes, but ironically, part of the problem is we've written lots of guides, we've got lots of help, but that means that our website is really quite complicated, and sometimes people get lost in it and can't find the guides. I would say that there's a website search in the top right of the website, and usually if you search there, you're given a choice of 6 or 7 things, and it's quite obvious which one you really need. So do try that. But the other thing is to look for the criminology page, where you will find email details for myself and Sharon, my assistant. You can email us, you can phone us. We do work normal 9 to 5 hours and not weekends, but you can actually make an arrangement to have an appointment online with us at any time, and we are increasingly offering webinars for individuals, particularly when it comes to search strategies, because then we can actually share screens and see what's happening, what's gone wrong with the search strategy, and offer some pointers about how to go.
It's really worth making the most of that, isn't it? Because if you can get to grips with the electronic resources at an early stage in your academic studies, really the world's your oyster, isn't it? Because there is so much really top quality resources that students can use, and as we know, the better quality stuff you're reading, the better your written work is going to be.
Well, I am quite willing to say that nobody can actually know how much is available to them. I've been working in libraries for about 25 years. I've worked at this library for 15. I've probably bought most of the current criminology stock, and yet every time I am addressed with a search strategy question, I always find something that I've never seen before. And it is simply because it's ever changing and increasing, and it's important to think that it's not limited, and we are not there actually acting as gatekeepers. We are trying to help you through the electronic barrier, which ensures that the publishers get paid what they need to be paid to keep the whole service running.
Excellent, thank you. You mentioned with electronic resources, you mentioned e-books, you mentioned journals as well. I'm sometimes not entirely sure that new students know what we mean when we talk about journals. Could you explain that more?
Well, I think quite often people new to working online quickly lose any idea of what it is they're actually reading. If I say I'm looking at a book, it is quite easy to look at a book and you know exactly what you've got, and you might know that different chapters are written by different authors, so it's an edited book. it's much more difficult when those chapters are disembodied and online and you can't see the context. So it's really important, I think, to look for things and before you even start reading them to ask, what is it? Academic journals are learned journals. They will have slightly different language, slightly more technical language perhaps, but they will also have been peer reviewed by academics in the field. So the best quality academic journals are totally peer reviewed and edited and will be sort of coming with a branding of being high quality. Having said that, in criminology there are also a lot of practical professional journals which look more like your normal magazine, have more photos, possibly carry more adverts, have a greater readership, maybe easier as an entry point. But the whole area of knowing what it is you're reading once you go online is slightly different because those visual clues tend to disappear. Quite often those professional journals have a single photo rather than a page of photos when you see them online. So they look more as if they could be truly academic. And it's quite a good idea when you're starting out to really look very carefully at what lecturers are doing on their reading lists because they will be signposting the best sources for their particular unit or their particular subject. And again, yes, you can ask me about finding resources, but you can also ask lecturers about the missing gap that you don't understand because quite often for any particular theory there may be 4 or 5 people who are advocates for it and one of them might suit you better than the one that's on the reading list. So asking for alternatives is always a possibility. Certainly I know most of the reading lists, having actually worked on all of them for quite a long time, but actually asking a lecturer if you're having problems will highlight to them how they could improve the reading list anyway.
Absolutely, and use that as the starting point for students, I think.
Yes, and remember that every single thing you read when it's academic will have references where it got the information from, which is a brilliant way of tracking things backwards. And then I can mention the G word. I'm not going to be particularly nasty about Google because it is a good service. I think students need to know about Google Scholar because in Google Scholar, if you go and look for a journal article that's been recommended to you, not only can you find that journal article, you can also see everybody who has cited it since it was written. So you can look for something slightly more up to date, perhaps something that's taken it apart a bit, and it gives you a little extra on top of the reading list.
Absolutely.
This is what's known as further reading.
And it takes you on that journey, doesn't it?
Yes.
Because you read one source and they refer to a number of other sources, or you see who cited it since. So you're going backwards and forwards, aren't you? And then in doing that, you're just broadening and broadening and broadening. Of course, you've got to stop at some stage and actually write your essay. But you only need a couple of good sources to start you off, good quality sources, and then you're off, aren't you?
And I think it's really good because you can then actually see the evolution of things like criminology, as you were talking about in your first session. It is about joining up dots and seeing how one person's influenced another.
So important because all of the stuff that we're all involved with, all of the research we're involved with, it's not happening in a vacuum. It's happening because it's drawing upon the things that have happened in the past, things that might happen in the future. So absolutely, it's about piecing it all together, isn't it, rather than seeing each one as a separate entity.
And I think we are living in very interesting times, and I think that there are some very clear lessons that we can learn from what's currently going on with the examination of American politics in particular, and people's resumes and their use of sources, and start thinking about the way that actually learning isn't happening in an isolated area for just academics. It's affecting the real world, and we need to have proper ethical standards within that.
Brilliant. Thank you, Linda. I'm forgetting about our board, so we must plough on. Ah,
Right, I've already mentioned the G word.
yes. So use of Google is not to be frowned upon, but it's about how you use Google, and particularly using the Google Scholar, which is a very useful tool.
Yes, Google Scholar is a really useful tool, particularly if you're having problems with access to things, because obviously electronic stuff occasionally goes wrong. Because Google Scholar will not only link to the paid-for version of a journal that we have provided for you, which I'd much rather you used because we actually buy things on the basis of cost per use, but if something has fallen over, you may very well also find a free PDF that's been deposited in a university archive.
Yeah.
So it's a good way of doing that. But there is also a dichotomy in the sorts of material that ICGS students ask me about. And whilst academic and scholarly material is really important, it is really an idea to think also about official publications. And those cause tremendous problems. I'm sure you've received an email from me recently saying, have you got this on your desk? I've lost it and the Home Office hasn't got it. So it's important, I think, to know how to use Google well. And that means not just typing in search terms. It means taking control of Google and asking Google to look specifically at particular sites for particular types of material. Again, there is a library guide on this, and I think perhaps what I could do is put together a little handout of useful web addresses for people to use after this session. But you need to take control of Google and tell it what you want and be quite specific. The other thing is that I think too often we turn into Humpty Dumptys. There's a brilliant piece in one of Lewis Carroll's books where Humpty Dumpty says, when I use a word, it means what I say, nothing more, nothing less. And I repeatedly tell people, it's not true. If I search for galaxy, Mars and Milky Way, I don't get chocolates. My science colleague who sits opposite me would be quite happy with the results I get. They're cosmology. And different words mean different, the same word can mean different things to different people.
Interesting.
In criminology, the one that I usually cite is rehabilitation. Rehabilitation not qualified, usually it leads you to cancer treatment and heart disease. If you are looking for work with prisoners, you need to actually put the extra word in. And it's those sorts of searches where you're looking for government policy as well, is that knowing that if you actually search for the specific site that is likely to be the expert site on that, you're actually going to get better results.
Brilliant. Thank you, Linda. This is why we have librarians on, actually, so that we can have references to Humpty Dumpty. Fabulous. We've got a question that's come in, Linda, from Lee. Lee has problems finding relevant books and articles using Google Scholar. Is there a guide published anywhere on how to use it best?
Right, yes, there is a library guide, and I will send the address so that everybody's got it.
It's on its way.
However, I would say that Google Scholar is not going to highlight books very well.
Yes.
And I think in that case, I would go back to the reading list most often. But the Google that covers the whole of the university library holdings is something called Discovery, which is that blank space in the top right-hand corner of the library website where you can just type in what you want and get an enormous amount of stuff back for you. The problem is that it is not as sophisticated in its interpretation of your search as Google has learnt to be.
Yes.
So what you need to do is use that, look at the results, and then try playing with your search terms to add extra words to actually define exactly what you want.
So also, Lee, to look at the Discovery, on the top of the library website, top right-hand side, there's a Discovery tab, and then you can click your search terms in there.
If you specifically, Discovery as a whole will search books and journals, and it searches electronic books to chapter level, it searches journals to article level. If you're really looking for a book, you may be better searching with broader terms in the library catalogue, which is the next tab along, because that will give you both electronic and print books. It only searches at book title level, but sometimes at that broad level you actually get stuff that is edited books with lots of chapters from lots of different viewpoints or about very similar subjects in a variety of ways. So it's a good way of getting a variety.
Top right hand corner.
Yeah, everything in the library catalogue that is available for online access will have online access when you click on its title. You just click there and then go through the Shibboleth login. If you want to avoid the Shibboleth login, do consider installing a VPN so that you
virtual private network.
Yes, so that you look as if you're coming from the University of Portsmouth, no matter where you are. If that won't work for you, perhaps because you don't actually own your own computer, so people who are using a works computer or who are perhaps on a public network, then you can use web proxy. And the explanations for that are again on the library website.
Very useful.
I will re-watch this video and make sure that all of these web addresses are made available.
Pablo will hold you to that.
Yes.
Right. Number 3, top 4 areas.
Oh, it's settling for second best. Smith said, Jones said, that sort of thing. I do think that sometimes you can actually go a little too far. If you've got a quote from Machiavelli and you don't really want to go back to the original Italian and read him, that's okay. But I think when you're actually talking about theorists and relying on their evidence, it's a good idea to try and find the original work if you can. More worryingly is the very modern stuff. A news report about a government initiative is not going to have a lot of detail. It's not going to give you stats, and it hasn't really got any air of authority about it. I always think that a bibliography should have that air of authority, come from a reasonable source. So newspaper articles, TV programmes, even press statements are a little dodgy.
And particularly because if you get to the bottom of the press statement, there'll be a link to the original document that you can go straight to.
Yes.
If you have it online.
And I think quite often a press statement or a pre-released speech is suddenly altered on the day. So actually going to the government department, it is much better to get that. Newspapers and news media have their own particular area where it's really useful to use them in terms of if you are looking at public opinion, how things have developed over a particular issue. You might very well want to look at it. If you actually want to track back attitudes towards particular crimes, you can do that. But it is very much more about public opinion and original research rather than about being authoritative academic work. And it's quite difficult sometimes because online everything merges and it all just is a website address. It is very easy to sort of stray over boundaries and not realise you're doing it. So looking for the original source is always good, and in that respect I think again taking Google as the tool to use, I would say taking control. And if you are talking about a new piece of legislation, don't just settle for what the newspapers say. Go back to the parliamentary website and search it. And I hate to sound biased, but I would put in a word for the House of Commons and the House of Lords libraries. They do really brilliant briefing notes that not only give you what the policy is going into the creation of a new piece of legislation, but most of the background as well, with useful and usually live references, so that you can actually track things back. And that's very difficult to do It's really important to think about using Google on that sort of research.
Yeah. And I think if an essay question talks about a particular theorist or a particular piece of work, it's absolutely essential that students go and have a look at that work rather than looking, as you say, at what A, B and C say about that person's work.
Yes.
And if a reference is in the essay title as well, even more, you know, if there's a quote in there, go and
Yes.
find the original source of that, because there could be all sorts of things either side of that quote that tells you a whole new story about the question.
And it is also, people like quotes.
Mm.
I would say that using quotes sometimes can sort of backfire, particularly if you're not sure about the origins of the people talking. So if you're using a quote about law, for instance, quoting an American judge is not really going to do you any favours. You really need to be quite sure that you're grounding it in the context that you're working in.
Absolutely. I recently marked an essay on the history of the police that looked almost entirely at the Metropolitan Police Service's website on the history of the police, which said that it's all really been fabulous. Haven't been any problems at all over the years. So yes, do check those sources. We must carry on. Number 4.
Well, hopefully, talking to you and being live on stream, I have made it clear that the library's a friendly place with people there to help. As I said, email, actually phoning up, the online chat, which is the purple speech bubble, which very few people explore, and they should. Between 9 and 5 it's great, and we are shortly going to go into a pilot where we will be offering 24/7 support for that.
Brilliant.
So it's worth looking out for those of you that are on different time scales.
All
then,
working into the early hours of the morning.
Yes.
Brilliant. Now I've got a quick fire round for you now, Linda, before we go on to finish off on referencing. So I prefer print books. What are my options if I'm in the UK or if I'm overseas?
If you're in the UK, you can apply for a postal copy of the print book. There are disadvantages to that. It will cost you. You are going to have to pay to return it by recorded delivery, and it will also take slightly longer. Print books, if they are being used by a student here, could be out for as much as 3 weeks before we even get them for you. So you have got a longer delay. An electronic book is going to be not instant perhaps, but certainly within 2 days you will have got to what you need.
And if you're overseas?
And if you're overseas, I'm afraid you are limited to just chapters of books. This is basically because overseas covers the whole world, and we have had problems in some countries with censorship, with post being interfered with, so we don't post books out. And certainly I think talking to somebody on the library staff, if you've got a problem about a particular book, we can sometimes organise. The limit is usually a chapter, but we can also possibly point you at a reading list which features another chapter, so you may be able to piece together enough to get through the assignment.
Great, thank you, Linda. And all these quick fire questions have all actually come from students in the past. Another one for you. Is there any software that will do my referencing for me?
There is, but I wouldn't encourage it early on. I think it's really important to understand the structure of referencing, etc. And also to start with, your first essays are going to have fewer references anyway. So if you work on those and actually understand what the correct structure of each reference is, and we do have a tool to help you with that, it gives you patterns, it doesn't do it for you. I would say that that is the best way of going. As you go further on, and particularly at dissertation level or postgrad level, you might be wanting to look at a system that offers more scope to actually collect your sources together and to do some of the referencing for you, in which case the university can give you free access to EndNote, but it's a web-based EndNote, and once you leave the university you are not going to have access to it. There are other free referencing tools around, including one that's incorporated in Microsoft Word, but I would suggest talking to someone in the library about what you want to do what your future aims are, and then thinking about which ones would suit. I would say that just recently, breaking news, one of the most popular systems that people have been using has been RefMe. That has been bought out by another referencing system, which we are no longer recommending simply because it exists outside of the safe harbour for data protection.
Right, okay.
And you must realise that if you are collecting references, you are collecting data that could be attached to you and may be misused.
Yeah, okay. Thank you, Linda. While we're on the subject of referencing, our next board...
Oh, this looks even worse.
It's all about errors, isn't it? It's a shame. Top 5 referencing errors. Number 1.
The reference list. We always talk about the reference list. Most students initially talk about bibliographies, and a lot of students who've perhaps recently done an A-level or something like that have learnt that bibliographies can be quite general. And certainly I watched my own son put together bibliographies for his A-levels, which were basically, well, I'll search the library catalogue and I'll write down every book I can find.
Right, okay.
So he's found them in the library catalogue, he never read them. That's not the point of a reference list. A reference list is to help your reader understand your reasoning, and therefore it needs to contain every single piece of work that you have used in your essay.
Yes.
Now, you may have read more than that, and it is a great pity. It is not a waste because it's informed your understanding.
Yes.
But if you haven't used it, it's not in the reference list.
Yeah. And I suppose in a way, if you haven't used it, it probably wasn't an essential part of your answer.
No. And the other thing is, of course, that particularly if we start looking at problems around plagiarism, plagiarism software will pick up mismatches between in-text citations and references, which will immediately start people thinking about, do I have to look at this more closely? So actually checking that your reference list tallies with your in-text references is a really good idea.
I have a question from Wayne. Is it frowned upon to just use academic journals or books for an essay if you're struggling to find any other sources you consider relevant to the essay you're writing?
It depends on the essay. It can be.
I would like nothing more than an essay that just had academic journals and books in their reference list.
Yes, it's perfectly good, and particularly when you're talking about theory. I think the possibility is that you're going to branch out of that if you're looking at things like policy and changes in policy. You are going to have to look at official documents. And if you are going to talk about criminology in a sociological context, about the influences and say things like at the moment about, I've just been looking at something that someone asked me about attitudes to the police from different communities, then you may very well be wanting to look at newspapers simply to get a feel for what actually is happening in the real world.
Yeah, and maybe pressure group work and things like that as well. But I would say, Wayne, absolutely, academic journals and books would be the sort of creme de la creme of your sources, really, wouldn't they?
Yes, it really is horses for courses in this case. And I think as well, it does depend at what level you're working, because obviously we get more original research with interviews and things like that later on in someone's academic career. And for undergraduate work, it's only at dissertation level that we start doing any actual original research resources.
Okay, thank you, Linda. Can you believe the time is just flying by? It's a good job Pablo hasn't had much to say, I suppose. I'm going to take...
Well, we've already talked about referencing at Portsmouth.
Referencing at Portsmouth, very, very useful way to find out how to do referencing properly. Because you can do all sorts of search things, can't you?
Yes.
Typing them into the box and making sure that they're really helpful.
Yeah, you can use the search box, or there is also an A to Z guide. All you need to remember with referencing at Portsmouth is that we do assist every student at the university. So there is an APA version of a reference, there's an OSCOLA legal version of a reference, and there's also a Vancouver version of the reference. Make sure that you're always looking at the APA.
Forget those last two.
forget the others, always look for APA, and you get patterns to follow. And having those patterns to follow actually starts to help you understand what it is you've been reading. One of the big problems that people have is distinguishing between an authored book and an edited book. And in fact, I think the best explanation I've heard of it was from Mark when he talked to students about thinking about it as either the greatest hits of one group or the hits of the 90s, which could be several groups.
That's good.
It's sort of whether it's an eclectic mix or just one point of view.
Yeah, brilliant. Gary wants to know, is it necessary to reference within the text the same piece of work every time you refer to it? So if you refer to it in the same paragraph, do you need to keep using it?
Yes, you would, because hopefully you're not repeatedly referencing exactly the same piece of information.
Yes.
There will be several page numbers to use,
Yes.
and you are pinpoint referencing in most cases. It's not saying I've read this book, you're saying I found this view on page 15,
Yes.
and then there's this other view on page 60.
I wouldn't say you want it at the end of every sentence though.
No.
If you're writing a paragraph, if you explain at the top of the paragraph, Smith has outlined 4 different ways that we can analyse this topic. You would probably only need to mention it once more, wouldn't you, within that paragraph. But I think, Linda, you make a really important point there, is that you should be referring to lots of different sources along the way. We are very short of time now. We've got not collecting all the necessary information as you're going along.
Yes, always a big mistake.
Absolutely lost then at the end. And then our final one is not recognising different types
Which we've
of
already
sources,
talked about.
which we've talked about already. And of course, importantly, the final one is do not give up, because of all of those areas that you've
Even
just
if
said
you
are
haven't done
relevant.
what we've said and you've not recorded what you've used, I am used to answering the question that every librarian dreads. Do you remember that big red book you showed me? I can't always do it, but we can usually try and narrow it down for you and find the book. So if you think you've got a reference that you have simply not made a note of, we will try for you. We just don't guarantee always to succeed.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Linda. That's been really helpful. I've learned some stuff there myself as well. I hope that's been really useful for you as well. So thank you to Linda, the University Librarian and the Criminology and Law Librarian.